Now, you asked me to show you this, so here you go. I asked the question, when it comes to Federal Reserve notes, it is my understanding that it is the Treasury that prints the notes. The Treasury can only print notes after the Federal Reserve agrees to purchase the bonds and or securities of the United States. Then those bonds and or securities become the assets of the Federal Reserve. Is this correct? And it come back and says, now you got to understand this AI system is a closed system. It's only pulling from the Westlaw database, not from the general web. Okay, your understanding is correct. The Treasury prints Federal Reserve notes, but this process is contingent upon Federal Reserve's agreement to purchase U.S. bonds and or securities, which then become the assets of the Federal Reserve. Now, and then if you look at the law, the bank cannot loan their assets. Okay, printing of Federal Reserve notes. The Secretary of the Treasury is responsible for printing Federal Reserve notes according to 12 U.S.C. 418. Secretary of the Treasury must ensure that plates and dies are engraved to guard against counterfeits and fraudulent alterations. Treasury then prints and numbers the notes in the required denominations to supply the Federal Reserve banks. Additionally, the plates and dies used for printing these notes remain under the control and direction of the Secretary of the Treasury, and the expense incurred in printing, issuing these notes are paid by the Federal Reserve banks. Now, if the Federal Reserve banks are acquiring the expense, like any other corporation, they pass that cost to the customer. Purchase of bonds and securities. Federal Reserve banks are authorized to receive Federal Reserve notes upon depositing eligible paper. There's that chattel paper, that commercial paper, gold or gold certificates providing a gold reserve of not less than 40% in such note is maintained. That's Rachel v. Federal Reserve Bank of New York. This indicates that the Federal Reserve must have sufficient assets, such as bonds and securities, to back the issuance of Federal Reserve notes. The Federal Reserve Act allows the Federal Reserve Bank to discount notes, drafts, and bills of exchange arising out of actual commercial transactions, including bonds and notes of the United States. Federal Reserve notes as assets. Federal Reserve notes are considered obligations of the United States and are receivable by all national member banks and Federal Reserve banks. They must be redeemed in lawful money on demand. That's US v. Grimmore. This classification underscores that Federal Reserve notes are backed by the assets held by the Federal Reserve, including U.S. bonds and securities. So, yes, the Treasury prints the Federal Reserve notes, not the Federal Reserve Bank. And this actually lines up with the congressional record, March 9th, 1933. See, we didn't technically go off the gold standard. We went off the physical gold standard. But look at this. This is the congressional record, March 9th, 1933. And if you go down to page 2, right here, in the middle of the page on the right, under the Federal Reserve Act, obligations that are deposited as the security and gold for reserve notes are placed in the hands of the Federal Reserve agent. What are those obligations? That's government obligations. Go down. So they redefined what gold was. They made the bonds and securities of the United States the new gold. That's how they got everybody on the petrodollar. And they call them on page 5. Under the new law, the money is issued to the banks in return for government obligations, bills of exchange, drafts, notes, trade acceptances, and bankers' acceptances. The money will be worth 100 cents on the dollar because it is backed by the credit of the nation, not the credit of the people, the credit of the nation. It will represent a mortgage on all the homes and other property of all the people of the nation. So, This is what I'm saying. People think the Federal Reserve is doing it. It's actually the Treasury that prints the money.